It's our stories. Welcome to a world where real stories sounds like a movie script.
I never expected the worst day of my life to arrive, wrapped in something as small and insignificant as a silver foil disc. It was the kind of thing you would normally brush aside, a tiny circle, no larger than the tip of my pinky, lying on the bathroom rug like a coin dropped by a careless god. Morning light sliced across the floor, a thin ribbon of sunlight that made the foil glint like a secret. I remember pausing at the doorway, half asleep, thinking I might step on something sharp. The house smelled like coffee and detergent, the ordinary comfort of a morning that had no reason to be suspicious. I picked the foil up and the tiny printing caught my eye. A little numeral 2 on the back, the sort of backing you find when you push out a pill from a daily blister pack. Immediately, my head filled with small, ridiculous possibilities. A candy, wrapper, a scrap from a package, some tiny piece of something innocent, but there was a hollow feeling that spread from my ribs down into my gut. I am Adam, and my wife Claire and I had both had checkups recently. The doctor had said the same thing to both of us. You're in good shape. I had a vasectomy years earlier, after we decided we wouldn't have more children. Claire had been on the pill in the early days, before we chose a permanent route. After the vasectomy, she had supposedly stopped. And yet, there was Tuesday's foil glued to my mat. I didn't confront her that moment. There was a strange, almost animal instinct to gather more before I accused someone of tearing our life apart. Maybe it was professional caution, engineers like systems and proofs. Maybe it was cowardice. I set the foil back where I'd found it, smoothed the rug so the room looked untouched, and went to work as if my hands contained nothing but blueprints and spreadsheets. But the image of that tiny circle would not leave me. At the office, I should have been reviewing contracts. Instead, I found myself watching the clock with an unbearable itch in my throat and searching the web for discreet testing kits, small voice recorders, and covert cameras. I ordered a few things under different names, had them sent to the firm rather than home. The act of clicking, of assembling tools that belonged in spy thrillers rather than the life I once had, felt like taking a step across a line I had never seen before. The packages arrived on a Friday. I had them rerouted to my office so Claire wouldn't ask questions. That afternoon, while Evelyn, the children's carer, fed Noah and Mia, I moved through our house like a man who had eaten sharp truth. I put tiny cameras in the bathroom, the bedroom, the living room. I told myself it was temporary, necessary to know whether this suspicion was an intrusive thought or a real wound. I took cheek swabs from Noah and Mia then, pretending it was a silly game, sliding the Q-tip along their smooth cheeks and posting them to a lab under an assumed name. I swabbed myself too and sent it off. Facts, I told myself. Facts. Facts only would allow me to act without losing any more than I had to. On the face of the days that followed, Claire was ordinary. She smiled at the kids, managed meals, kissed me on the forehead before she left for work. On the inside, I felt like a man walking on a cracked bridge and listening for the thud that would tell him when the next fissure opened. Then, on Saturday, the bedroom camera caught something that made my breath stop. Claire had stepped out of the shower wrapped in a towel, moved to the vent grate, opened it, and placed a small phone into the ductwork. She had a second phone I did not know about. I'd been checking the wrong line. That evening, after she'd gone to bed, I loosened the vent from the kids' room where it connected to the other side of that duct. The phone was warm, as if it had been recently used. My palms shook as I cloned the device into a small drive, my hands performing a practiced technical move that my mind could not steady. I slipped the phone back into place and walked into Noah's room. He was curled in his sleep, a small fist, draped over the blanket, soft breath blowing the eyelashes on his chubby face. Mia was tangled in a stuffed rabbit. I kissed their foreheads, and the act felt like a selfish theft. I had stolen a piece of their privacy to learn whether they were mine in more than name. By the next morning, I had the cloned messages open on my screen. They were explicit, without ever stating a name. Laughter-filled texts, hotel references. Afternoon, messages timed to my travel days. There was cruel humor baked into them, jokes about how easy it had been, about scheduling around my trips. Names weren't always necessary. The cadence of intimacy was. My hands went numb reading lines that imagined me as an idiot and presented the affair as a harmless convenience. Nora, my secretary, found me that afternoon hunched over my desk with tears streaming down my face. She's a pragmatic woman, older than me by a few years and firmly anchored in the world. She slipped me tissues, didn't ask for explanations she had no right to. When I told her the whole ridiculous and terrible story, the foil, the cameras, the clone phone, she shut the door, sat down and said, "We need a plan." Her competence felt like cool water. I told no one else. I called Sophie, a divorce attorney Nora recommended, and drove to her office with my head a mess of schematics and coffee stains. Sophie has the sort of look that suggests you would not want to get on her wrong side. She asked straightforward questions, made lists, and said things I needed to hear and did not want to hear. Gather evidence, secure the company finances, and do not let your emotions be visible in court. "We can go nuclear," she said calmly, "but you must be willing to live with the wreckage that will cause." I nodded because the alternative, doing nothing, suddenly looked like letting everything collapse. Marcus, my business counsel, sat with me and sketched a cold arithmetic of risk. He explained how to separate company assets, how to move liquid capital into corporate safety, how to buy out partners in ways that would keep the business operating and protect employees. It felt obscene to sell retirement funds and move the money around as if shuffling cards would spare other families from my private ruin, but I did it. I refinanced, I cashed certain accounts and placed them where a divorce claim could not reach. For every move, for every spreadsheet line, I felt an amputation at the edge of myself. But business is practical, and as Marcus kept reminding me, my engineers and staff were not collateral to be gambled away. The DNA results came like a gut punch. Nora read them first with a hand that did not tremble but held something heavy. Both tests for Noah and Mia returned a match with the same man. The pattern matched the dates and the timelines. There was no kindness in the numbers. I sat there with a sense of being unstitched. The life I had believed in, every tooth lost, every bedtime song, every scraped knee kissed by a father, was not untrue in memory, yet it was now tangled in a betrayal that made it different. Sophie and I filed. It was methodical. Divorce papers, a suit for alienation of affection, a claim against Ethan's employer for failing to enforce their no fraternization rules. The legal machine moved with a speed and an appetite that frightened me. Notices were drafted. Process servers stood by to hand-deliver documents at precise times. I felt like I had become a person who operated in the space where ordinary grief intersects with strategy. We served the papers simultaneously at Ethan's office, at Human Resources, and at Claire's desk. The sensation of watching envelopes go out was at once vindicating and shameful. There is a dignity in telling the truth, and there is embarrassment in making wounds visible to the public. When Claire arrived at the house after the papers had been handed to her, she looked like she'd been dragged through an emotional storm. Her hair was limp, makeup smudged, eyes red. "I'm not interested," she said when I opened the office door and she stood framed in it. There was that stunned, rehearsed line that people use to ward off consequences. I had rehearsed my own lines, practiced a coldness I would not have believed I could sustain. I told her to collect her things and the children and to get out. It was monstrous and terrible. I remember her voice, begging, shaking, and my own voice, another man's voice I didn't always recognize, telling her she had to go. The house, our house, had suddenly become a legal object. The deed was, for the moment, my name. Evelyn, the carer, left in a rush. There were consequences I hadn't intended to unleash. She cried, said she had to support her own family, and stepped out as if the floor had become lava. My parents called in a flurry of disbelief, pleading for calm, for the cooling of anger. I wanted to explain. I wanted them to understand the cruelty of having a life made of shared memory that now lay in the crooked mirror of deception. But calm felt like a luxury I didn't have. Claire filed a temporary restraining order against me, claiming emotional harm, and for a few hours I felt it like a suffocating thing, being told you're dangerous in your own home. We had prepared for such a maneuver. Sophie had compiled the cameras, the messages, the receipts, and pointed out how the protective order was a predictable tactic. The judge saw the evidence, the origin of the cameras, and the facts of the discovery. The order was lifted. Ethan, meanwhile, lost his job. The company had a strict policy, and his actions violated it in a way that made corporate action inevitable. It felt small to see him let out, but the sense of justice was complicated. Small comfort in the crater of what had happened. There were other legal details. Settlements were negotiated with HR. A lump sum payment that would allow me to cover the loans I had to take to keep the business afloat. I did not relish the arithmetic that made my life about numbers and ledgers, but the relief of having those obligations met was its own strange medicine. Then came the funeral. Ethan died suddenly in a circumstance that left us all stunned. A call from Nora told me he had been found. My reaction was a colliding of emotions I could not sort. There was no triumph in his death. There was a complicated hush, the way the world closes around tragedy. I found myself murmuring, in a moment of private dishonesty, that perhaps fate is a rough equalizer. The impulse to feel vindicated was shameful, and I chastised myself for it. I attended because you attend funerals of people who had mattered in some part of your life, even if that part had become twisted. In the weeks that followed, the empty house was intolerable. I sold it at a loss because the rooms held 1,000 small proofs. The sticky marks on the table from the kids' juice cups, the lavender Claire had planted that still bloomed in a stubborn strip along the fence. I moved into a small rental at first, then found temporary refuge at Nora's place. She had a spare room, a warm, quiet home that smelled faintly of lemon and old books. Nora functioned like a map, directing me through the steps I needed to take: file the corporate protective papers, finalize the buyout of Robert, who had agreed to sell his shares, and handle the divorce decrees. I hadn't planned on a romance when this storm hit. Nora was supposed to be a friend, a steadying presence who took my phone and scrolled through emails I couldn't face. She packed me a bag in one quick morning and told me to leave the house. "You need air, you can't get there," she said. There was a candor in her voice that felt like loyalty. We had always kept things professional, but in private, she was present in a way that Claire had not been for months. She brought food. She brought silence when I didn't want to speak. The months slow down when you are picking up the pieces. There were depositions and interrogations into bank transfers and hidden payments. Sophie had found corporate expense items that matched gifts and dinners. I learned that sophisticated infidelity often leaves a ledger, that desire makes technical errors. The discovery process is like a waterfall. He keeps revealing new stones, new bruises, one after the other. Noah and Mia were the cruelest casualties. The DNA results said they weren't mine. I remember the sensation of my world tilting like a ship in bad weather. I cried in a deli booth with Nora, tears that felt like they belonged to someone else. My identity as a father had been central to who I was. All the bedtime stories, the scraped knee kisses, the quiet songs I hummed in the car were unchanged in memory, and yet the knowledge shifted everything. The presence of another man's genetic code in their small hands made me suspend part of my claim to fatherhood. It was irrational and heartbreaking. I loved them still in a way that transcended biology, and that was its own burden. Loving someone you know to be not your own brings a grieving of the illusion, as well as a fierce protection of what is real. There were nights I sat on the couch waiting for sleep that would not come, watching the house breathe, replaying scenes. I remembered Claire teaching Noah to tie his shoes, the ridiculous way she clapped when he finally managed it. I remembered her laughing at a ridiculous show and tipping a pillow at me when I pretended to snooze. She was not all betrayal. That realization complicated everything. Humans are capable of beauty and deceit, often in the same person. That is what made it hurt so much. The law grinds. The paperwork was delivered, the court date set, Sophie knitting the case like a surgeon. When the final settlement check came from Ethan's company and the residual funds arrived in the account after the legal dust settled, I felt an odd release. Money cannot heal a child's disappointed eyes, but it can allow a business to breathe and employees to stay on. There is a moral geometry to that. It felt like turning some of the bitter into something that could sustain people. I tried therapy. Dr. Hargrove had a calm voice and a habit of asking questions that landed like stones you can hold. He made me describe my panic physically. "When you think of them, where do you feel it?" he asked. The therapy room felt safe. Lemon tea, a low stack of magazines, a couch that creaked in a familiar way. We worked on separating guilt that was mine from guilt that had been foisted on me by deceit. He helped me understand that being deceived is not a moral failure. It is a victimization of trust. I tried to keep my hands busy, working late, fixing the office leak, teaching a junior engineer how to solder. Small repairs feel like prayer sometimes. A colleague, David, brought in a thermos of soup and a wad of children's drawings for Noah and Mia. Those small acts held me upright. They were reminders that not all human responses bent toward cruelty. Many bent toward tending. Nora and I grew closer slowly. She refused to be a replacement or a savior. She simply stayed, showing up in practical ways, laundry folded, a text at a small difficult hour, the kind of small consistency that builds a life that will be lived slowly and without grand gestures. There was a moment in early spring when the sky went a nameless pale, that she kissed me not with the theatricality of a movie, but with a steady, warm assurance. It was the kind of kiss that says, "Let's try again." I realized then that my life could have a future that did not include the script I had been handed. I still replay certain conversations in my head, trying to figure out the missed cues. There was a small private thing Claire said once that made no sense at the time. "Hey, he's so understanding," she said about Ethan in a casual after-party conversation. And I had laughed and brushed it off as office admiration. But later that sentence sat like a nail in the wood of memory. The aftermath required such extraordinary patience. Court appearances, affidavits, the slow, meticulous shredding of a woven lie. I had to authenticate photographs, cross-check dates, prove presence and absence. The performance of walking through a legal and emotional minefield is not heroic. It is exhausting, precise work, and Sophie, for all her edge, was a fierce ally. When the divorce was finalized, the judge's signature felt like an exhale. I was free and alone, legally unbound, and the paper in front of me felt like glass. It had edges that cut and gave me, ironically, the clean air to breathe. Months later, I visited the little strip of lavender Claire had planted years before. I dug gently and added another sprig, the tiny ritual of planting something as a symbol of a new attempt at growth. The physical act was humble and felt for the first time like the right thing. It was not about erasing the past, but acknowledging it and choosing a small future anyway. I have tried to rebuild trust in myself, trust in my judgments, and in the capacity to love without being foolish. The work of self-repair is small and daily, waking slowly, making coffee that does not taste like ash, calling a friend, answering an email with patience rather than fury. Nora taught me to cook a simple roast. We started going to a small theater on Wednesday nights and to farmers markets on Saturdays. The world did not explode. It stitched itself in a new pattern that respected what had been lost and held what might yet be made. I do not have all the answers about Noah and Mia. We tried supervised visits, then therapy involving all of us. There were small, bright hours when Noah made a joke and my stomach warmed with a love that refused to be complicated by facts. There were other hours when I looked at Mia and felt a hollow ache that would not lift. Rebuilding a relationship tainted by deception is slow and fragile. Sometimes I would pause at the grocery aisle and cry, public and ridiculous and human. Sometimes I would laugh with them over stupid cartoons and feel that lightness like a secret treasure. There are moments of regret. I regret the cameras, or I regret not having had the courage to speak sooner. The truth is messy. I tell anyone listening that no single path is simple. Gathering evidence felt monstrously invasive, and I would not recommend it as an ideal first response. But it gave me clarity in a fog. Clarity allowed me to make choices with some measure of control. If there is any lesson here, it is the brutal kindness of honesty. Secrets have a gravity that distorts everything around them. When they fall away, you can rebuild, slowly and with care. I was not proud of the cruelty I sometimes showed. I would not pretend I handled everything right. But I sought solutions that protected others, employees who relied on the firm, children who should not suffer the collapse of my business. I tried to keep my moral compass from spinning into something monstrous. There were tender, absurd, and human moments that shifted me. A neighbor left muffins on my doorstep once. A woman at the supermarket who did not know me said simply, "Keep going," and handed me an extra napkin after I'd spilled something. Those moments restored a small faith in strangers. The kindness of people who do not know the particulars of your pain is often the most astonishing. Years later, I still feel the uneven edges. I still have flashbacks to a message I once read on a cloned phone, and the memory makes my stomach drop. But the raw, burning fury softened into a resolve to live differently. Nora and I married quietly in a small ceremony at a municipal office, surrounded by a handful of friends who had stood by me. There were no fireworks. There was quiet, a sense of being present and chosen. Money cannot buy back time, nor can it make children my own in the biochemical sense. but it can repair some of the damage done to livelihoods and allow for a memory to be reclaimed without the constant pressure of financial ruin. I paid my dues, literally and figuratively, and I learned a measure of humility that only being broken can give. Now and then, I still find myself thinking about Claire. I do not wish her harm, nor I do wish to return to what we had. The trust was breached in a manner that was not simply a mistake, but a sustained deception. Forgiveness is not a linear path. It is a work that takes place in breathless seconds, and sometimes in polite, awkward meetings in the presence of mediators. I wish her healing of the kind that is honest and hard-earned. If you have read this far, I want to end by asking you a few questions. This story is not only mine. It is a thing that, when shared, becomes part of a conversation about betrayal, trust, and recovery. Have you ever found a tiny clue that led to a much larger truth? What did you do next? Did you confront, or did you gather proof? If you were in my shoes, would you have acted differently? How do you balance the need for facts with the desire to preserve privacy and family dignity? And finally, to those who have come through something similar, what helped you rebuild a life that felt secure again? Please, leave your thoughts and stories in the comments. If you have advice, practical or emotional, about evidence, legal protection, or healing after betrayal, share it. I read every message, and your experience might help someone who is sitting right now in the quiet, staring at a small, useless piece of foil, not knowing what to do next. Thank you for staying with me until the end. How would you have acted in the protagonist's place? Write your thoughts in the comments. More fresh and controversial stories every day on my profile. Like and subscribe to this channel.